Hey guys, welcome back to True EV. This episode is all about when you have a strong range, but a weak hand. These situations are very rich in fold equity, but one of the biggest mistakes that newer players make is that they fail to realise that even if their hand does have a bit of showdown value, checking may not be the best play. You can take hands that do showdown for some pot share and turn them into bluffs if and only if you think your fold equity is good enough that the EV of bluffing is actually even higher than the EV of checking. We're going to start off here with a hand where we definitely have some degree of showdown value and we choose to bluff. Before we get into this though, I should also just point out that when you reach the river with no showdown value and your range is quite strong, either because the run out has come down in a way that smashes you, or you've taken some kind of filtering, condensing actions earlier, like you've been calling your opponent's bets and then your opponent's checked. We know from the Clarke poker school that those are river blunder theorem spots. That means you have to bluff with no showdown value in all of those spots where your range is strong. We'll see some of those later, but sometimes you even have to bluff with showdown value. You have to take what has now become roughly near the bottom of your range and turn it into a bluff, both theoretically and exploitatively. And I think there are both theoretical and exploitative reasons for why we should bluff the river here. These hands, again, coming from my 100 Russian cash challenge that's underway, and we have Jack 10 offsuit in the big blind here. We peel and open from a reg. 3-bet here not being totally unreasonable, but mostly this is going to call. Villain goes for a large bet on this flop, which is quite interesting. I think when players at these stakes do this, even the better regs actually, I think what we're going to see is an equity-driven range. We've talked about that before in the series. Equity-driven means that hands that have nothing, hands that are very flimsy, that have very speculative redraw, are just going to be very unlikely. And value hands and hands with bigger redraw like Jack 10, Jack 9 backdoor, flush draw, Ace 10, etc. Just going to be a bit more prevalent in the pool's range here, as are things like King X and 2-pair plus. What's going to be unusual for this sizing would be something merged like second pair or third pair, though some weaker players will do that. Regs are not going to be so guilty of that. And then the very low EV bluffs that are meant to be happening in equilibrium, like 7-5 of spades and stuff, are just less likely to find this sizing. Or maybe something a bit more hopeful than that, like the 10-9 or something. Again, a bit less likely to find this sizing if they just have 10-9 of spades here. Overall, I think the raise is going to be a very infrequent guest in our range, in theory, in a spot like this. Exploitatively, if we think their range is equity driven, what we really want to do is build more of a value heavy raising range in spots like this. So if we do have a hand like Queen 8 here, for talking's sake, that's a hand that in equilibrium is going to probably mostly call, because there's not going to be a ton of raise against this polarized sizing, especially when we're in position and have control over that pot growth later. But it's going to raise at some frequency, and in reality, I think raising is going to be the better play, because if we think our opponents are building around higher equity draws that are just bet calling a lot and top pair that's bet calling a lot, then there's really no reason to slow play in a spot like this. Slow play is, or call I should say here, is a play that maximizes EV against the bottom of people's ranges, not the top. The way to maximize your EV against your opponent's top to middle stuff is to fast play when you have a good hand, and the way to maximize against the really bad stuff like the naked gut shot and worse is to slow play when you have a good hand. And if we think the latter isn't represented enough in the opponent's range, then slow playing is just way worse in reality than it is in theory. That's what True EV, the name of the series, is all about. So with Jack 10 here, I think this is a pretty forced call in real life. Because I expect this to just be equity driven, I expect my fold equity if I raise to be not very good. I expect people to be at least over defending on the flop after betting this sizing in general. Now that doesn't go for everyone, but this is a general population read. And then on the turn and river and many runouts, I think there'll be some over defending going on as well, but there will be some reasonable bluff opportunities later. But no, I think calling is the best play. If our opponent's raising here or betting here really equity driven, we can also expect to get 3-bet on the flop by the top of their range a bit more than normal. So I think call is the play here, the only play, and that's what we decide to do. Villain then pots the turn. Again, my read here in terms of True EV is that this is more equity driven than it should be. It's going to be a lot of, for value, I would say King 10, King 9 plus is what it should be. In reality, probably more like King Jack plus perhaps. And then bluffs that have more equity than they need to have, let's put it that way. There'll be some pot-sized bets that are fine in equilibrium here with maybe Ace 5 with the Ace of Hearts, like an overcard with the nut flush draw blocker, increasing fold equity. Like the theory of that's going to be okay to do this with, I think, but I don't think that's going to happen as much in reality. So again, a bit equity driven. Jack 10's becoming kind of close here. We're getting 2-1. We do have a bunch of outs. Some of those are less live than normal. If villain has more heart-heart combos in their range than usual, then Jack 10 is going to go down in EV because the 9 of hearts and Ace of hearts are just going to be outs less often. Thankfully, the Ace of Hearts is very often going to be in villain's hand here when they have a flush draw, and so it's less likely to come. But then, you know, some of our outs are also blocked by their bluffing range. So there's lots of reasons to think that in Equilibrium, like, this is probably just printing a bit of money as a call. There are some reasons in real life to think it's worse than normal. One of them just being that you don't run into, like, the very worst bluffs as often. But yeah, I think this is still okay in position to call. Out of position, an open-ender like this is probably just going to become a fold in most spots where showdown value is very limited because you don't have the option of bluffing the river. One of the reasons why calling here is going to be fine in theory in position is that whenever villain gives up river, which they will have to pretty frequently on a brick, you're going to be able to bluff with massive fold equity. Your range when you call this turn bet is already strengthening significantly. You know, you're moving towards combos like King X and flush draws a ton, Queen X of hearts, a bit of Jack 10. You're not going to have any naked gutter here. On a heart river, you're really going to struggle to have air, right? You're just going to have very few combos of air. And on this river, the Jack of hearts, we actually end up landing with a range that can't have air. So let's explore that a bit further. Why can our range just simply not have air in this spot? Well, to call a pot size bet on the turn, we either need showdown value, redraw, or both. Showdown value is still showdown value. If it's not improved to 2 pair or something, it's still 1 pair. And if we had a draw, it just got there because we're not calling the turn with any draws that are weak enough to miss here. I can't even think of a draw that's weak enough to miss here entirely. So Jack 10, villain very quickly checked here in game, by the way. This is a reg that I know is at least semi-competent. I don't know how good this player is, but I know of them and I know that they're not like a very bad reg or anything like that. Don't know enough to say that they're good. But when they check really quickly here, the odds of them actually slow playing are going to be tiny. One thing that solvers are going to do here is they're going to take some combos that block your calling range and they're going to actually slow play with them. So when villain has ace queen of hearts here, it's very plausible that they might actually check the river all the time in theory or something like that. Don't quote me on that, but there will be some combos that the solver wants to slow play here. When humans check, they very rarely have those combos, and when they check quickly, they almost never have those combos. I think that's a good way to put it. So what that means is that villain's range is now, in 90 to 95% of cases, I would say capped at 2 pair. Something like that. I think people with a set are contemplating a value bet of some sizing here. I think with a straight, you're probably just value betting some sizing here. With a flush, you're probably going big or at least value betting something, or at least thinking about not value betting. If you're going to check, you need to come to that conclusion. Someone tank checked the river with quads against me in a spot like this earlier, and I just thought that was funny that they used their whole time bank and then slow played. But yeah, we are in a situation where we can't really have a worse hand than this. We don't call a turn with naked 10-9. That would be a straight, or naked Jack-9, I should say. We call the turn with Jack-10 plus. So we don't have anything worse. We literally have the bottom of our range. We have a snap check, and we have a mighty range. We've arrived on this river on a node where it just looks like we never have nothing and always have something. So to me, this is a no-brainer bluff, but I think a lot of you guys miss this, and that's why I want to include it at the start of this video. This is the kind of bluff that is supposed to work more often than the break-even point. And thank God, because folding is the break-even point. So if this bluff only had an EV that was the same as folding, that would be really terrible. So this bluff will yield, I don't know, the majority of the time you're meant to get a fold here in GTO. In reality, this bet probably gets through like, I don't know, 75-80% of the time. This is how you need to think as a poker player. You need to try to estimate what kind of bang for your buck you're getting. Like, what is your risk reward? Like, this would break even at, you know, risking 3/4 pot here, 2/3 pot here, break even at about 41% fold equity or something like that. Now, break even would be a terrible EV because checking would be worth more than that. Sometimes the opponent has just given up with, like, I don't know, ace 5 or something like that. But then it's kind of weird that that would often contain the ace of hearts, and it would very often just be bluffing river, or at least contemplating it. So I don't actually think there's much showdown value by checking here. I think we lose the vast majority of the time. Like, maybe we win against like 5s with a heart that bluffed the turn but didn't want to bluff the river or something. But I'd say our showdown value is sub 10% in this spot after the quick river check from a competent player. Competent players aren't checking out of disgust or revulsion. They're checking because they have showdown value, and they are in that band of their range. Or at least that's why they're checking quickly. So if checking is worth like 10% of the pot in this spot or worse, and it is significantly folded in Equilibrium, and this is a bluff in Equilibrium, and it's overfolded in reality, not bluffing here would be very, very bad indeed. This is a spot you have to find. It's a very, very good spot to bluff in. Your bluff will get through almost always, and you need to say no thank you to whatever sort of dribs and drabs of showdown value you actually have in this spot. Villain told me I sucked here. He used the "you suck GG" emoji upon folding quickly here. So I very quickly flipped over the Jack 10 and said, ha ha, because I'm very mature that way, and I'm not at all toxic at the tables. Let's look at another example of weak hand, strong range, where you've just got to bluff. Okay, another blind versus blind spot. I really enjoy playing in the big blind against small blind raises. It's one of the more creative spots in the game tree. Ranges are very wide, it's super easy as small blind, you know, with the combination of having a weak range and being out of position to boot. It's very, very easy just to go massively wrong. And as big blind, being in position, yeah, you've got a really bad range yourself, but you go last on every street. Your opponent's going to have an absolute headache. They're going to be face up and transparent. In a lot of these cases, it stakes like 100 Russian cash. So I feel like my edge is pretty big in these spots. What that will allow me to do is call more. You know, this hand is a call anyway, or a 3-bet, doesn't really matter. But there'll be hands that aren't a call in GTO, like something like 10-3 suited, and I feel I can go ahead and make that call even if it's losing, like, I don't know, 3% of a big blind or 5% of a big blind in theory, because of how difficult it is for human to play the small blind, and because I think I can play far from perfectly, but relatively much better out of the big blind than villain can play out of the small blind. So at these pot odds, there will be many hands that I'll defend here for reasons like that aren't quite on the books. I won't defend 8 deuce off, you know, there are limits, but I'll defend wider. So we have queen 10-8 rainbow. Villain goes for a check, and betting already here is honestly not bad in real life. I think in theory it's okay as well. You know, you have some of these low backdoor draws. Because the 8 exists here, the 6, the 7 will give you something. With the 4 or the 5, you can even keep bluffing on these nodes because people are quite capped. So even if you bet flop here and then you turn a 4, you can probably overbet and do really well. The reason it's so good to just attack here in general in spots like this, on textures like this, is that this pool is not very good. And this goes for, you know, any site where you're playing micro stakes or low stakes. The pool is not going to be good at protecting the checking range here. As you move up in stakes, you know, you will get regs that do a good job of that. And you'll even find some exploitative sickos that overprotect the checking range if they think that pool stabs too much against check. But for the most part, people are underprotecting the checking range massively. The other reason it's pretty good to attack here and then just go nuts later is that your value range is really abundant on this board. Very often, when you're the pre-flop caller, you have a super capped range and you're repping very few value combos. So if the board is 7 deuce deuce and you start going insane, okay, that might work. People might just be checking too much ace high and folding by the turn, so it might be okay results-wise. But implications-wise, you know, you're not really repping that many value combos when you go nuts there and empty the clip. You're just saying that you flopped a deuce, which is kind of combinatorically sparse. But on this board, queen 8 could be 3x3, 9 combos. 10-8 could be 9 combos. Queen 10 could be another bunch of combos. You probably 3-bet queen 10 suited a bit pre, but you've still got quite a few combos of that. You've got jack 9 at 16 minus the times you 3-bet pre combos, which is a hell of a lot. You can even raise flop with like king, queen, queen, jack here if you're picking a small sizing. So overall, raising a flop c-bet here is really good, and betting is really good, and it's just a spot where your range is strong, and the better players in the pool are going to acknowledge that, and they're going to really proceed with a lot of trepidation with their one pair hands, usually letting them go by the river. Like if someone has kings here and they check and you bet, you pot it, and they check call and you triple off, kings does not want to bluff catch you down on a board like this generally. This is a very good sweet spot. It's what we'd call a hotspot. Mass data stables, you know, these places that want to give their students the cheat sheets and make sure that no one else finds out. Like a lot of what they're telling people to do is just attack regs in spots where regs hate calling down. So if you ask yourself, how would I feel facing 3 streets of massive aggression on a texture like this? You'd feel really bad because the big blind's range does contain all of those nutted hands, and because it's harder to overbluff and easier to underbluff when your range is really value heavy like that. Anyway, this time we checked for whatever reason, which might be missing a bit of an exploit actually. I don't like hate this in theory or anything, of course, but I think in practice bet is maybe a bit better, so a bit of a misstep there. So it's so important to scrutinize your play. You know, it's so easy to just switch off and miss an opportunity. And we are trying to absolutely maximize EV in every spot, of course, so we want to find every little last drop of EV, and we can do that when we're playing our A game. We struggle to do that when we're not focused. But anyway, this is not a mental game lesson on the ace of diamonds turn. I think it's pretty clear here that bet is the best play. We have 5 high. Checking is not going to go amazingly for us. Our showdown value on the node where we check back and then bet river is going to be limited. To boot, we're also facing a river, bet out of position here from villain quite often after we check back, both as a bluff and for value, and many of the hands that make those bets either as a bluff or for value are going to fold to a line like bet over bet here. So we go for this big bet here, villain calls. It's very important in poker to never lose sight of the lost art of hand reading, to never stop hand reading, and always ask yourself what's roughly going on. That doesn't mean that you need to list exhaustively every combo that your opponent can have, but it does mean that you should be thinking about what clusters of hands they have most frequently and what makes up the gist of their range. Because while you don't want to target, you know, we obviously famously hate that at Carrot Corner, You don't want to target one type of hand randomly. You do want to target, in a sense, the bulk of your opponent's range, because that's what's driving most of your EV, because it's the most frequent part of the game tree. You want to cater your decisions in life for what usually happens. And in poker, it's the very same thing. You want to cater your choices to what usually happens, not one outlier possibility. So when we bet here, we are fully planning to follow through on lots of rivers and overbet and do stuff like that. We have hit a bunch of 2-pair and king jack now. Our range is relatively okay with value hands. It's not amazing because we did check back flop, which is why I think we just do really well against reg specifically by blasting off here. But on the king river, it once again becomes very, very hard for us to have air. So if you look at our range here, we could have bluffed the turn with king 9 or jack 9 or something. That's now got there. Or it's at least hit a king. We could have been bluffing with just a naked jack X. That's now got there. It's really hard to see that we can have too many combos of nothing unless we were just betting big with like 5, 4, 6, 7, 3, 4, 5, 3 of diamonds. I guess these are the main bluffs here, but it's like a little smattering and we can have a straight loads of combos of the time. So if we have almost no air and pool doesn't really perceive us to bluff, like to have a 10 here because we wouldn't just bet the turn with a single 10, and we're not bluffing a king on the river, or not perceived to be at least. Maybe we should bluff a king on the river, that's another story, but we're probably not perceived to be. Villain is really not going to want to call down here with 1-pair, and Villain's going to have a lot of 1-pair because it's blind versus blind, a ton of their range. And now remember, they underprotected on the flop, so they probably don't have king, jack, ace, jack, jack 9, jack 10. Often enough, they're probably drowning in ace 6, ace 4, ace 3, ace deuce, ace 5, ace 9, stuff like this, basically. Queen X as well, like queen 7, queen 9, queen 5 suited, that kind of thing. This is probably a lot of their range. When they do have a jack, they're of course going to call. They're going to be check calling the river, and they can have a jack. They can have queen jack, jack 10, jack 8. They can have pocket jacks. They definitely can have a jack here. And so I don't go huge. I was praying I wouldn't go huge there. I was like, please don't like pot it or do something ridiculous. You want to size down in this spot. This is a good sizing, because when your opponent's polarizing and when a river card comes which causes your opponent to fold many of their combos that are now just really, really bad in absolute hand strength terms relative to the board, you don't need to invest very much to do that. Meanwhile, if villain does have ace king or a jack or pocket aces or something, it's pretty unlikely that they're folding to many bet sizes at all. And of course, if you go 3x pot, it's ludicrous because you just give a jack a ton of money for no reason, and villain can actually just only defend a jack. In fact, even if you go pot here, villain is getting pretty close to just only having to defend a jack with like some 2-pair, maybe. So by going this sizing, not only is it theoretically a bit better because we're, well, a lot better, because we're forcing villain to become indifferent now with other bluff catchers, you know, stuff that's not just top 2-pair or whatever, but also we're risking less against a very polar range. When your opponent's range polarizes due to a run out, as it does here, because a straight becomes the immortal nuts and 1-pair becomes crap, you're in a situation where you can make the crap fold with a smaller bet and you can save money against the immortal nuts. Another thing we should say is that people aren't going to raise you here just because you bet 820. You want to be careful that you don't get inside your own head and say, well, I bet so small, they might attack me, they might bluff me now, they might know I don't have a straight. But you could easily bet this size with a straight as well, because it's super hard to get paid off by anything worse if you start approaching pot with a straight here, because a single jack makes a straight. So this is exactly the kind of spot where you have a really, really strong range that's mostly just straights. You have a few combos of air, and if you don't bluff air in this river, and I know some of you don't watching this, it's true, that's where you're throwing away a ton of money. And that's why strong winning players, when you look at their graph, they'll have a flattish red line. It might be winning, it might be losing, but it will be something flat. And when you look at someone that's struggling and stuck at the micros and is suffering from passivity errors, their red line is, 45 degrees down. And if your red line is going 45 degrees down, it could well be because you're not taking advantage, or partially it could be because of this, you're not taking advantage of weak hand strong range spots like this one. So this is a really, really mandatory bluff. Moving on. Queen 7 of diamonds, we open the button, we're called by the small blind. Always a bit of a red flag that your opponent's not going to be particularly skilled. Big blind calls as well, and we get a flop of 10-9-5. Multi-way pots are pretty fun because they're played quite transparently. I never mind just checking a flop in a spot like this. I don't have a nutty flush draw. It's not like if I bet my fold equity is going to be great. In fact, people tend to underfold in 3-way pots because they don't react enough to the multi-way aspect of it and the pressure that that puts on them to fold more combos. So they end up stationing a little bit on the first couple of streets, which means you can triple quite successfully in these spots, but it does mean that, your fold equity right off the bat might be slightly lower than it would be in a 3-way sim. Not that we particularly know what those are, but we've done a bit of 3-way simulation with a program called Simple 3-way. And we've seen that it's quite counterintuitive, you know, like a lot of 9x is being folded on the flop to half pot here and stuff like that. So yeah, they're going to station a bit here if you bet. That doesn't mean that check is way better than bet. I think both plays are okay here. I'm not too sure which one's better, but I definitely would be really shocked if check wasn't fine. So we checked for whatever reason, and villain leads 375. Now, with the 7 here, what's happening in real life, again, we're always trying to compare real life to the solver in this course True EV. What's happening in real life is that villain is more merged than they should be. They have way more second pair type holdings than they should be. They have more top pair. They probably don't put the nuts into the sizing all the time, although some people will sometimes. And then in terms of bluffing, they're going to have the more equity driven higher end of that for the most part, like queen jack or at least some kind of decent straight draw, double gutter, I don't know, something like that. They're not just going to have like a straight draw to the 6 particularly often in a multi-way pot here, although it's not impossible. So strongish equity driven range. I think call is the right play here. I actually like this player. I don't mind this player coming along, you know, because I'm losing most of the time anyway. And if they do come along, I probably have no showdown value now, but I do have a lot of implied odds and redraws. So I'm happy just to call here. I think this is the right play. Villain folds, and the river comes in another 4-liner to the straight, and again a fairly quick check. I know this is a replayer, so I don't mean that I pressed the button quickly. This was a fairly quick check from the opponent. And again, you have to take stock in this spot. You have to say, right, okay, what's happening here? What is going on? So clearly if I check, my showdown value is not nothing, but close enough to nothing that we should certainly be contemplating bluff. That's to say, to not contemplate bluff in this spot is to ignore a crucial tenet of poker, and that is that you need to take the best play and you need to compare both of your options whenever there's any chance that they could be close, or whenever there's any chance that the default naturally arising option in your brain is wrong. And there's definitely a very good chance that checking is wrong here. If you check, your EV is probably going to be in the vicinity of like 10% pot again, because like people do lead with 7-6 sometimes, or they lead with pocket 6s, or they lead with a 5, or they had ace deuce of diamonds and just are repulsed by the river and don't want to follow through. So yeah, you probably have 10-15% showdown value here. What happens if you bluff though? Like if you pick a sizing like this, right, which is kind of a cheat code. This is a bit of a sweet spot sizing against recreational players, especially because recreational players are kind of like those animals that are like mostly blind, but they see like vague shapes, right? I don't know what animal that would be, but there's definitely like some fish in the ocean that use sonar or whatever to hunt, but they have like some eyesight and they just see like very vague shapes. I think dogs have like kind of bad vision like that, but they see mainly like, they don't see colors or whatever, they just see like vague shapes. When a weaker player looks at the sizing, they see overbet, they see like a lot of money being put in. They also see a 4-liner to a straight, and they've also checked quickly enough here, or even just checked at all, in a way that means that they have a straight almost never and have 2-pair plus rarely. So again, if you're mostly against hands like King 10, Queen 10, Ace 10, Ace 9, King 9, Queen 9, these hands that got bet too often on the turn, something that doesn't contain an 8 basically, and something that's not 2-pair, this bet is going to massively outperform its fold equity target. And again, it would not be very good if this bet just worked 52% of the time like it's supposed to break even, because breaking even by betting when you can check for 10 or 15% pots is a disaster. So in order for this bet to actually do well, you could do an EV calc here. You could try and figure out what is the fold equity that makes it better to bet than check if checking is worth 15% of the pot, right? You could do that if you wanted. We're not going to do it in this video, but we could. If, for example, you were getting 75% fold equity here, clearly this is better than checking, I would think. If you're getting 80, it's way better than checking. And I think in this spot, again, like this is where the real skill of the poker player comes in. Like how much fold equity do we think we're getting? Let's try to estimate it. I would guess it's going to be in the vicinity of 70 to 80%, maybe more. This is a play that you can easily miss when you're asleep, when you're just using very broad strokes, when you're thinking in black and white, when you're just seeing a 7 and going, I have showdown value. You can easily miss this as well if your brain is being repulsed by the 4-liner. It's just like, it's gross, it's a 4-liner. But then you're not hand reading, and that's the real issue. The reason people's red line sucks is that they don't hand read. They focus so much on like their own hand and the board and how it makes them feel, and they're governed by their negative emotions, their anxieties and fears and resistances, that they're unable to actually see these golden opportunities to print money by bluffing and by turning hands that could check for some profit into bluffing. The goal is not to do something that is plus EV. The goal is not to do better than folding, funnily enough, in a spot where you've been checked to. The goal is to do better than checking. And checking is more than 0 EV, but betting is more than that. And it doesn't really matter what your solver says either. I think your solver will bluff this hand for what it's worth all the time. But that doesn't even matter. That's not the point. The point is that the human is grossly overfolding here. Even more than a solver will. A solver will normally fold when it checks here. But a human will practically fold every single time. Printing money spot. Queen 8 offsuit. Again, back to our favourite spot for today. Blind versus blind. You can see how many of these spots come up in position. One of the big keys to these spots today is that they've all been in position, and villain has always capped and checked on the river in a spot where our range is doing really well. And that could be based on texture, it could be based on action sequence, right? Both of those things help you have a range advantage. Again, we face this kind of non-standard big bet. I don't know if this was a reg, I don't remember, but I think this is a very clear call. Raising against the big bet with a hand this mergy is not good. If villain does 1/3 here, you can for sure raise a hand like Queen 8 small and go from there, because they just have to, well, one, they have to fold hands that are kind of live, like ace 5. For two, you know, they have to call plenty of worse hands, but when they're already starting to polarize a bit and you have this hand, you just want to be calling. Turn is a king, they bet small. I like call again. I mean, this is not one of the most bluffed spots in the world, and the reason for that, or I should say it's not one of the most overbluffed spots in the world, and the reason for that is that it's just more value combos appearing in villain's range now on the king. There just are more value combos. 16 combos a jack 10 hit. They'll often bet bigger, I know, but you get the point. King X, you know, gut shots from the flop hit, random King X hits. There's more 2-pair now. A queen can still value bet the sizing. There's a lot of value combos. When we're talking about bluff catching, we always ask ourselves not just how much air does a villain arrive with and how likely is a human to bluff if holding it, but we also ask how abundant is the value range. And in this spot, the value range is really abundant. So even though this bet is going to be mergy and fish are going to bet here with jack 9 and 10-9 and pocket 10s and pocket jacks and queen 4 sometimes and pair plus draw and draw, and you are going to be ahead here a lot, and you need 20%. So it's clearly a call. I mean, it's not one of the most amazingly overbluffed spots in the world. When weaker players are betting small like this on the turn, there are a lot of spots where you're just absolutely printing by calling. I don't think this is one of them, but I think it's still a call. And the ace river degrades our hand, so look out for this pattern. You were calling with a hand that had a lot of showdown value, and then your hand plummets in check EV. So again, it's another spot where if we check back here, and for what it's worth, the solver might well check this combo back. It may not bluff this high up, by the way. Feel free to check it out and let me know, but that has no bearing on what you should do. Okay, so be very clear about that. You need to make up your own mind based on what's happening in the real world. But if this is a check in GTO, that doesn't mean that betting would be that much worse. And it doesn't mean that in reality we can't bet. And the pattern here again is that we had a hand with enough showdown value to check back the river, but then two things happened simultaneously. One, the ace degraded our showdown value and made us win less often by checking. And two, it created a situation where our range is very strong and drowning in value combos. So now any diamond, diamond, any 2-pair to the ace, any jack 10. Okay, that was already nutted on the turn, but yeah, we have a lot of value combos here. Most of them flushes, some of them 2-pair. And we have very little air. Like, again, ask yourself, how do we get here with air when we call the turn? All the flush draws got there. We weren't calling turn with a naked gut shot like jack 5. We're barely calling flop with that. If villain bet big on flop, which he did, we're not calling flop with that unless it's diamonds. So we're again in a situation where the bottom of our range is something like a 9. Like the worst hand we can actually have here is probably jack 9 or 10-9. So given that Queen 8 is not much better than that, and given that we think this is going to be underprotected, there won't be many slow plays, and it's going to be folded really often, we should for sure turn Queen 8 with the 8 of diamonds, especially. That's just icing on the cake, by the way. Don't worry about the blocker. If you ever see training content where people are like, you should bet because you've got the 8 of diamonds, you know, they're missing the forest for the trees. That's not good content for you to listen to. You should never listen to someone that's just telling you what a solver's doing. Unless it's a theoretical course and they're explaining axioms about the game, like we do in the Clarke Poker School. But you don't ever want to look at someone who's just reviewing a hand and going, oh, the solver says it's fine, good job. The reason this is a great overbet is that the opponent's range is mostly 1-pair, and our range is terrifyingly strong and has almost no air in it, and people are going to fold to this 80% of the time. We got called here. I can't show you hands that worked, because poker's not that simple. Sometimes you do the right thing, and your opponent inexplicably played deuces that way. Hilariously, deuces is probably a fold against the pool now, against this sizing. If I had deuces here, I think I would fold the river. And that might sound absurd to you, but deuces becomes a bluff catcher. The big blind is overbetting with only straights plus, and they have plenty of flushes here. Any King X or Queen X, because those cards are not diamonds, it's really, really easy to have those hands that are abundant pre-flop and have flushes here a lot. I don't even think I would call deuces here, but I don't expect a random weaker player to fold deuces here, right? I'm not saying that like I expected that hand to fold, but that hand's super rare. Sometimes it'll value bet river, and most of the villain's range is way weaker. And weaker players are going to let go of King Jack, which is what they normally have here, or Ace X, or whatever it may be. Ace 10, Ace Jack, King Jack, King 8, Queen X that they merge turn with. Look out for weak hand strong range spots. This is the final hand for today. We have the Queen Jack of clubs. We 3-bet. Villain calls in a hijack, small blind versus hijack, 3-bet pot on 975 two-tone. Big bet here, it's fine. I mean, I have a bit too much equity to want to check fold, and I don't really like check calling for obvious reasons, and I think check raising is just quite bad against pool here compared to betting. I think I prefer betting. You could tone this down a bit. I could go like 916. It's probably better because I don't think there'll be a ton of sensitivity between 1260 and 960 here, for example. So going 40% pot is better than going 60 here. So a little bit of a misstep here from me sizing wise, and your solver will never reflect that, right? The solver can't possibly understand that because in its domain, its opponent is perfectly elastic and reacts and calibrates perfectly correctly to all sizing increases and decreases. It's like Rain Man. So there's no way of actually getting extra EV by changing your sizing in spots like this in GTO. It's just not a thing. Like, it might prefer frequency-wise a certain sizing, it might opt to go down a certain part of the game tree, but there's nothing you can do with your hand specifically to size in a better way in GTO. That's why GTO is a barren, depressing, cold, and dead place. But the real world isn't. It's warm and vibrant and thriving. The reason for that is that humans are actually going to react in an imbalanced but predictable way that you can garner extra EV against by looking at your hand and playing that hand against your opponent's range, not playing your range. This is the key misapprehension. You do want to understand how your range is and what it's perceived to be and what your pool thinks it is, but that's the most directly relevant thing, not what it actually is. There's no causal relationship between what your range actually is and your EV of different options unless your opponent is also believing your range to be what it actually is. That's important. On the ace turn, I think we should bet. We probably just do very well by tripling. Now, okay, if they have ace X of hearts, that's bad. If they have a set, the good news is that they will raise flop quite a bit in these situations if they're recreational, and a lot of these opponents are. This is fine. I don't need to go too big here. There are hands like 10s that could fold immediately, regardless of sizing. I could go a bit bigger, but I don't want to go really above half pot here, I don't think. You could go maybe B60. But the real sweet spot is the river, because when the king of spades comes, many of my draws were king X, right? Like if I was bluffing the turn with a flush draw, I had a king in my hand pretty often. If I was bluffing the turn with something else, like Jack 10, sure, I can still have that as air, but it's really difficult for me to have tons of air combos here. And I do have a ton of combos like Ace King. I have a ton of combos like Ace Queen. I have some sets like 9s. I just have plenty of value hands here. I have a really strong range. It's hard for me to have absolutely nothing. And given that the opponent's range does contain 6s and 8s and 10s and Jacks and Queens and stuff like that, and King X of hearts, just hands that might not want to stack off very often, I think this is a really overfolded spot. I think this is the kind of run out where people have to call more than just the ace X of hearts and have to slow played some of their sets and stuff. And I don't think either of those things will happen enough. And I think this is another great example of strong range, you know, the pre-flop configuration here being important because we have 3-bet small blind against hijack specifically. We're doing very well here. Our value region is quite vast. Our bluffs are few and far between. Not a spot where we're perceived to just be overbluffing, and not a spot that is overbluffed. This is a spot where if you call down with pocket 10s, you will lose a lot of money. You know, like Villain 24 shouldn't call against pool here with a bluff catcher. Even with the best bluff catchers, even with like ace 8 of hearts, it's not clear that calling is winning against pool. It's probably losing, even though GTO will do it. Very instructive stuff, I think, in this video, like very important pattern. That's what we're going to do throughout this series, throughout True EV. Is we're going to refer to these patterns and we're going to get you guys to basically learn them and play your hand against your opponent's range and understand which of your options is better and free yourself from the shackles of copying solvers and getting lost in the labyrinth of your own range and strategy. Play your hand read, understand theory, but deviate once you know what's going on in real life, and always ask yourself what your opponent's doing. It's only by asking that question that you get better at finding the answers and finding the right aggression in spots like this. Thank you so much for subscribing to Carrot Corner, and we'll see you back here for another episode of True EV very soon. In the meantime, do check out the other content from our wonderful coaches. They're doing a fantastic job, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.